Hello, I'm Tom Langton, and I've prepared a dozen or so peer-reviewed papers, reports, and short articles on the multifaceted bovine TB epidemic in cattle over the last 5 years. Today, in May 2025, I'm starting this 20 or so minute presentation with a quotation from the Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana, who concluded those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This sentiment applies to why things go wrong and to the situation with bovine TB or BTB in much of Northern Europe and potentially all of Europe as disease control standards are increasingly strained by economic productivity demands. Research carried out from the late 19th century informed what from the 1930s to the 1970s was a relatively successful BTB control effort in many countries with infection suppressed to very low levels. What we've seen since, however, is a return of BTB to epidemic levels since the mid-1980s, other than in Scotland, and the mass culling of badgers where the disease has become embedded in the Republic of Ireland and much of England, and arguably it's as bad as it ever was. So I'm going to look at what's gone wrong and why this could be. One of the things we do know is that when bovine TB is introduced by cattle movements, a range of wild and other domestic mammals and potentially other species become infected, and that they carry it in their populations for different lengths of time. The extent to which they are carriers or infected and the manner and rate at which they may pass it back and on to other animals is largely uninvestigated and unknown using modern technology. Clues from recent whole genome sequencing methods lack effective time series and spatial sampling and are also prone to speculation. A further factor is that in various badger culling trials that have attempted to look at cause and effect, the role of the statistician and their decisions are naturally central to what gets reported and adopted as accepted thinking within government and beyond. The statistical role sits at the top of the information discovery process and is extremely influential. Whether those estimations and models are correct or incorrect dictates both the narrative and government belief system for policy, including the science that government publishes, sometimes using a small specialist community as peer reviewers to embed and reinforce government policy science into mainstream science. And this is one driver to what is called the reproducibility crisis and is a threat to the credibility of the science process in general. In terms of remembering the past along the lines of George Santayana, bovine TB was first detected in badgers in England and Ireland during the 1970s. The government review, led by Lord Zuckerman in 1980, was the first modern evaluation including wildlife and especially focusing on badgers. In it, the long Appendix 7 gave the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food view of what its cattle vets thought was going on. And I'll enlarge the flow diagram on the right-hand side, which is figure 1 in that Zuckerman Appendix 7. The surprise new MAF view back in 1980 was that bovine TB was, as they called it, badger TB, badgers being described as the self-perpetuating or maintenance host of the disease, overspilling infection to blind or dead-end hosts such as foxes. I go to the bottom of the diagram now. Moles, rats, and to cattle. But once it gets to cattle, there is only a remote chance of it being passed on, which was nonsense at the time, but few were alert to the historic research and background to what was known at the time. The view on further elaboration seemed to be that under normal conditions, badgers directly caused at least 50% of herd TB breakdowns, and that with onward cattle-to-cattle transfer, up to 90% of herd breakdowns were caused by badger infections, with only 10% generated via other routes. But at the time, the detail was rather fuzzy and fundamentally speculative. at a time where very few people were engaged in wildlife epidemiology. In 1985, a little later, a model was prepared by Anderson and Truella, formed around the 50% guesswork, which was not based on hard data, which the Dunnett Review in 1986 questioned statistically, and when it looked at the available data. In fact, MAF data did indicate the prevalence of BTB in badgers reduced substantially in a 3-county study as the disease declined during the 1970s, suggesting badger was more of a spillover host. But by now, the farmers had been taught that badgers were the issue, and a lapse in statutory testing meant the disease was growing out of control again. Now, there are 4 basic problems with the MAF epidemiology statements in Zuckerman, and here are the first 2. Firstly, microlesions in the lung do not make a cow infectious and a herd risk. And secondly, small lesions in the lung do not make a cow infectious and a herd risk. But in his monograph on bovine TB and TB in man in 1947, veterinarian John Francis showed how an invisible or barely visible primary focus of TB infection, when forming, may shed bacteria or bacilli into surrounding lung tissue and into the lymph and circulatory systems of cattle, thus potentially infecting elsewhere inside the body. With importantly, potential for secondary infections and excretion via bacterial shedding into nasal passages to be exhaled out and passed in dung, either outdoors or in the cowshed. And studies would confirm this in the late 1980s, showing rapid travel from a primary focus in the lung to the lymph nodes of the head and neck region. So these first 2 claims by MAF were incorrect and wholly underestimating the ability of infection to spread rapidly, both within the infected animal and externally to potentially infect other members of the herd that are in close contact, and especially in indoor confinement. One major problem here also is that the presence and number and size of small TB lesions are not always visible at basic slaughterhouse meat inspection and are routinely overlooked. And going back to forgetting the past, we can look back to the monograph, as I said, by John Francis in 1947, who concluded, "It is known that the primary focus in cattle may remain latent for many years, or at the most progress very slightly, but the complete healing which frequently occurs in man is rare in the bovine, and the lesions remain open." This view is supported by much epidemiological evidence. And he goes on to say that which shows that if any animal reacting to the tuberculin test, even with very slight lung lesions, is left in a herd, spread will be more or less rapid. So the third problem with the MAF contribution to the Zuckerman Review in 1980 is it's saying that mature lesions are almost always, 99.98%, closed in the lung, so cows are not infectious and a herd risk. The image here is borrowed from Waters and others in 2011. Basically, it is hard or perhaps even impossible to be sure about the active status of a TB lesion without examination and dissection, and even then, it's very challenging. In humans, it was shown recently that latency or prolonged remission is largely a case of cured TB, with return in later life apparently mostly due to susceptibility due to old age and a TB infection from a new external source, in fact. But unlike humans, cattle don't live for decades. And into old age and they are slaughtered really at the human equivalent of early adulthood, or around a quarter of expected life expectancy. And as Francis concluded from the range of early studies that he looked at, the walling off of bovine lesions with fibrous tissue that's reported in humans is not well recorded in cattle. So there's nothing to suggest that lesions cannot rapidly switch to becoming active when a cow is stressed or in ill health. And that's not infrequent in the highly bred milk-producing breeds. Hence, the tradition of stockmen of old to be checking the health and well-being of their herds and adapting care once or twice a day. Finally, the fourth problem, infection of lymph nodes in the neck with non-visible lesion in lungs, indicates primary infection was non-respiratory. Well, this is also wrong, and a misreading of the infectiousness of non-visible and small lesions too. MAF were not recognizing what had been worked out much earlier, that the lymph system serving lungs could be infected from the microscopic primary foci and non-visible or small lung lesions. That's why MAF misinformed the Gatcombe review in 1980, speculating that cattle were catching BTB from eating badger dung and urine. They claimed that it was being ingested and traveling to lymph nodes from the oral route and digestion. So together, these four crucial oversights, unfortunately, cemented the platform for the existence of a hypothetical wildlife factor in the disease cycle of the kind shown. And the simple oversights explain how from congenital infection, feeding of pooled infected colostrum and milk in the dairy, licking of infected body secretions by cattle, including transmission on saliva, cattle were infecting each other, often at a very young age. And these sleepers really to form and are traded on when a significant proportion pass the tuberculin test, which has a relatively low sensitivity. And a proportion of such cattle will pass multiple tuberculin and gamma tests. That's now fully recognized, enabling the spread of the disease almost as if from nowhere. And that is one of the drivers of the thinking behind a wildlife reservoir. Unless that is you check back carefully all contact herds for 4 or even more years to match their origin to a breakdown, with one recent case in Switzerland where bovine TB returned to a farm after 11 years, which has been under investigation. So from an experimental design perspective, whether or not young cattle transfer bovine TB to other cattle is a really key consideration. When trading into the experimental areas is surrounded by herds on different testing frequencies. So the design of the RBCT did not account for the difference in infection rate between cull and comparison areas, simply as it believed MAF with regard to the source of the infection, and that specifically young traded cattle were low TB risk, which was wrong. And there are similar concerns with lack of control for the 4-area trial in Ireland. And in England, this is something I noticed and tried and failed actually to raise awareness on regarding BTB in 2019 in a paper in the Journal of Dairy and Veterinary Sciences, which is where it ended up. So one important issue in all this is understanding how people perceive bovine TB, how it progresses, how they believe it progresses and behaves, which is often oversimplified. And it's often said to be a slow-moving and cryptic disease. So let's take a quick look at that. It's said to take months or years to pass between stock and become infectious with long periods of inactivity. But this is now known to be an inadequate general characterization on its own. While it is nowhere near as fast-acting as infections like mastitis that can take a grip in a few hours. Bovine TB has a generation time of 16 to 20 hours. So new TB infection and infections from bought-in cattle is possible within days and a few weeks. As also with congenital cases, that is mother to calf, um, and it only takes a few seconds or minutes really for a single bacteria to transfer and infect between cattle, carried on breath or in saliva on a shared drinking source on the farm or at a, for example, show, moved to a show. So yes, BTB can be a rapidly moving infection, moving and establishing in seconds, minutes, and days. But how long does it take for disease to progress? Well, upon infection, the immune system will normally attack and kill the bacilli shortly after arrival, or contain the infection in a stable state, sometimes called dormancy or quiescence. And that can last for weeks. It can last for months or sometimes even years, as long as the animal's immune system is not compromised by factors such as mastitis, Jones disease, pregnancy, that allow the disease to progress. Even treatment with certain worming drugs that immune suppress enables the infection, the initial infection or the slight infection to restart. And it really isn't clear if there's full shutdown or latency as reported in humans. As mentioned, cows generally don't live long enough to test that, so it's not clear if it can happen. But it's a huge issue for farmers, and one reason why slaughtering tuberculin test reactors may be killing some no-risk animals. But the problem is telling apart infected from uninfected and infectious from non-infectious individuals. When cattle veterinarians have been tied to highly restrictive statutory rules and regulations prohibiting their use of a suite of more advanced tests that are actually just sitting there waiting to do the job. So overall, for me, the disease is best characterized as a punctuated one, which can be slow or fast and infectious, and with an on-off switch that can defy detection using the tuberculin and gamma tests. The situation needs a more sophisticated approach in the future for any chance of significant progress. And again, dropping back to John Francis, we see the surprising prediction: if we continue to create a tested herd at a rate in 1938 to 39, we will have practically eradicated bovine tuberculosis within 30 to 40 years. So there is a very slow tail to eradication, and 40 years obviously puts us into the 1980s, where sadly the free market thinking resulted in easing off of statutory TB testing a few years too early, and sufficiently for that predicted endpoint to be, I suppose, sabotaged really, and the disease started to rise again by the mid 1980s. So the sad news is really that the predictions were missed in response to those views in the early 1980s that rested on the 1980 review. And as I've said, the four major misunderstandings here are key to comprehending the pathogenesis of bovine TB and its control. Prior to 1918, despite all the early research, it wasn't really realized by farmers and farm vets, for that matter, that tuberculin test reactors below the positive reactor threshold, sometimes called inconclusives or doubtfuls, had all, bar a very small percentage, been infected with bovine TB. It is now realized, as in Wales, where progress is being made without drastic wildlife interventions, that effectively all test reactors, tuberculin test reactors, should be treated as infected for control purposes. And that even if they pass one or two 60-day tests, tuberculin tests, a percentage, some say even up to 50%, are still unsafe as infected. And this is why current disease control in the now more intensified cattle industry has been ineffective. The graph here you can see is we published in January showing the trend in OTFW, the so-called confirmed, and the OTFS, so-called unconfirmed, this sort of artificial distinction that's been the bedrock of policy for England. And you can see annual testing from 2010 having an effect on the more developed infections, generally with visible lesions, but not the less detectable infections that, when traded, also drive the epidemic. This is why in the Republic of Ireland, disease has been stuck at around 4%, despite heavy badger culling for decades. And it's now rising with increase in large dairy farms, which can't be cleared with current statutory testing approaches. And it's why all reactors should be used when measuring interventions against control areas, as otherwise you're just simply going to get the wrong conclusions. And you can see here OTFS staying pretty constant and gradually rising throughout the process, where the OTFW cases are starting to come down. So what about all the studies that people say show badger culling works? The main problems with studies, and this applies to all of them, is that studying hotspots holds issues. Why? Because the more frequent skin and gamma testing tends to begin when hotspots occur. And the number of herds available to catch the disease in a given hotspot is unpredictable, often rising steeply or tailing down. And this is a really poor environment for paired statistical comparisons. Even if you have very large numbers of herds, if your number of paired samples is small, it's a tenuous comparison. And this is illustrated by the 1970s data from Thornbury in Gloucestershire, shown here. And I've added the point at which badger culling began in red. The x-axis is a little bit small for you to see. That's 1966 to 1998. The solid line is number of TB herd breakdowns, and the dashed line is the number of active badger sets that they knew about, which was perhaps 2/3 of them, according to those who were involved. And you can see that in the fairly isolated and contained areas of countryside at Thornbury, with relatively few herds, breakdown fell steeply by around 1/3 in the year before culling began. And while it may look like culling badgers finished the job, it's equally or more likely to be the result of better herd testing, as in the 1960s, where testing alone brought down BTB across the UK by 80% over just 4 years. The other characteristic of disease hotspots is that when not in a contained study area, disease may radiate away from the centre at variable speeds. And this creates an environment where the so-called perturbation effect hypothesis may originate. Playing with that kind of data and interpretation of patterns that reflect variation in rate of spread between contiguous farms and traded cars, yearlings, and even shared bulls. And this confounding element of hotspot study was a major problem for the RBCT and the 4 areas comparison, with just 10 and 4 pairs respectively, far too small for any serious interpretation. And leading to some wild claims of benefit that have fed many hundreds of papers. So when added to the miscast pathogenesis, and with the benefit of hindsight, it has to be said, it all adds up to 50 years of miscarriage of understanding of the disease and its control, and undermining the APHA, Animal Plant and Health Agency in England since 2013. The Brunton Downs Birch et al. Reports with the most recently a wild report of 56% benefit associated with badger culling that falls over for anyone looking closely. The lack of no-cull controls in the 4 areas badger culling trials, as in the Birch paper, just adds to the confused background where politicised decisions can create enormous waste and frustration. As you may be aware, proposals for 100% targeted culling in England were dropped last year, and it's more widely accepted now that badger culling is ineffective, even if researchers who've published on it are reluctant to accept that. And with this slide, I'm going to finish with a recommendation to watch, if you haven't already, the documentary covering 10 years of work by farmer Robert Reed and his vet Dick Sibley at the Save Me and the Save Me Trust at Gatcombe Farm in Devon. It features a farm where badgers live fairly close to the buildings, the farm buildings. They're infected with bovine TB, but don't give it to the outdoor herd, never give it to the outdoor herd, nor do they enter the sheds or pass it to the indoor herd. So bovine TB is primarily a respiratory disease, passed mainly via air droplets in breath and via saliva. But Gatcombe has demonstrated very well that in the cowshed, some congenital and fecal element is also prevalent, which after all is what John Francis reported in 1947. But the main discovery at Gatcombe is that removing TB from indoor dairy cannot be done using skin and gamma tests alone, as I mentioned earlier. It needs the 3 additional tests: actiphage, which is a phage test, Enfaplex and Edex ELISA, which are immune assays, and testing with these between the 60-day immune tests to pick out the hidden reservoir that was once thought to arrive from wildlife, all due to that incorrect math thinking back in the 1980s. Since 2018, we know so much more about the sensitivity and specificity of the tuberculin test, and how with the larger herds of today we can learn and adapt, which is actually what George Santayana was reminding people about in 1905. The answer is managing the disease down via better testing. And there's probably no alternative. Cattle vaccination may help, but not if testing isn't working. And it could be a £1 billion distraction to the cheapest and fastest answer, which is better testing and movement control. A policy that kills or vaccinates badgers, by my analysis and the hard work of others, will make little or no difference. The current test and slaughter approach to cattle cannot progress adequately for the reasons I've given, and farmers are now getting more aware of how they've been badly misled over the years. Not intentionally, but they've been misled. So we need to appeal to those whose work has been reliant on unsound logic, those often with papers and contributions that now need to be qualified and changed. Even in hindsight, they might be reluctant to accept this. Nobody wants to be wrong. But this is how science progresses, and this is how this epidemic emergency needs to be addressed. There really is an opportunity to prevent another 20 years of waste, hardship, and misery. So thank you. There's some other presentations on bovine TB interventions and other information that may be of interest, and you can find these on the links given here. Thanks for watching.